The billionaire promised to save my dying mother if I became his wife, but I soon realized I wasn't being hired as a companion. I was being recruited as a pawn in a dangerous game that could cost us both our lives. I didn't know that the mansion's walls were hiding a terrifying secret, or that the man I had tethered my future to was running an organized scheme that would soon tear the entire city apart. The silence in the waiting room of the provincial hospital was heavy, thick with the smell of floor wax and despair. My mother's breathing, rattling and shallow, sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. I sat on a molded plastic chair that dug into my ribs, clutching a crumpled bill from the pharmacy that I knew, with sickening certainty, I would never be able to pay. The doctor had been gentle when he broke the news, but his eyes were mirrors reflecting my own dead-end future. "It's a specialized treatment, Elena," he had said, looking anywhere but at my face. "Without it, we are just stalling the inevitable." The inevitable was a word I had been fighting against for 3 years, ever since my father passed and left us with nothing but a crumbling house and a mountain of debt. My life in this gray, soot-stained town had been a slow erosion. I worked 3 jobs, stocking shelves at the grocery store, cleaning the local bank after hours, and tutoring spoiled children in mathematics, just to keep the lights on and the pantry stocked with bread and rice. But the cancer didn't care about my overtime. The cancer was a glutton, and it was devouring my mother while I watched, helpless, my pockets filled with nothing but lint and desperation. I was 22, but in the reflection of the hospital's darkened window, I looked 40. My eyes were sunken, my skin sallow, and my hands were perpetually chapped from industrial-strength detergents. I was a ghost, haunting the corridors of a life I hadn't even begun to live yet. When the lawyer called, I almost didn't pick up. I thought it was a debt collector, another shark circling for the scraps of my existence. But the voice on the other end was smooth, precise, and lacked the usual aggressive cadence of the men who called to threaten the repossession of our home. "Ms. Elena Vaneva?" he asked. "Yes," I whispered, afraid to speak too loudly in the ward. "My name is Arthur Sterling. I represent Mr. Victor Thorne. You don't know him, but he has been observing the local community's challenges with a philanthropic eye. He is looking for a wife, and he has expressed a particular interest in your profile." I laughed, a sharp, jagged sound that died instantly in the sterile air. "Is this a joke? Because if it is, I'm busy watching my mother die." "I am perfectly serious," the man replied, his tone chillingly professional. "Mr. Thorne is 82 years old. He is a billionaire with significant health concerns of his own. He requires a caretaker, a companion, and a legal spouse to manage his affairs during his final years. In exchange for your presence, your loyalty, and your silence, he is prepared to pay off all your debts, secure the highest tier of medical care for your mother in the capital, and provide you with a stipend that would change your trajectory forever." I felt the blood drain from my face. It sounded like a fairy tale twisted into a nightmare. "Why me?" I managed to ask, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "Because you have nothing to lose," he said, "and because you are desperate enough to do exactly what is required without asking questions." He gave me an address, a sterile office building in the center of town that I had walked past 1,000 times, never knowing it was the nerve center of a vast shadow-draped empire. I told myself I wouldn't go. I told myself it was a trap or some perverted game played by the bored elite. But that night, as I watched my mother's skin take on that translucent, waxy sheen of the dying, the choice stopped being a choice. It became a calculation. 2 days later, I was standing in front of an oak door that felt heavier than a tombstone. When I pushed it open, the room inside was dim, smelling of expensive tobacco and age. Victor Thorne sat in a high-backed leather chair, his face a roadmap of deep, weathered lines, his hands gnarled like the roots of an ancient tree. He didn't look at me at first. He was staring at a tablet, his thumb twitching over a stock graph. "Sit," he rasped. His voice sounded like gravel shifting in a dark tunnel. I sat on the edge of a velvet chair, my cheap coat feeling like a costume. He finally looked up. His eyes were milky with cataracts, yet they seemed to pierce right through my clothes, through my skin, into the very marrow of my secrets. "I have your mother's files," he said, gesturing to a stack of papers on the desk. "I've seen the reports. She doesn't have months, Elena. She has weeks, possibly days." "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling. He leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking. "I want a marriage of contract. No affection, no expectations. You move into my estate, you handle my daily medical regimen, and you never, under any circumstances, leave the grounds without my express permission. You become the face of my household while I settle my final affairs. And if I refuse?" He smiled then, and it was the coldest thing I had ever seen. "Then your mother dies in that state-run facility tomorrow, and you continue to pay off your father's debts until the day you rot. But there is one more thing you should know." He tapped a button on his desk, and a large monitor on the wall flickered to life. It wasn't a bank statement or a medical chart. It was a live feed of the hospital room where my mother lay, and there, standing by the foot of her bed, were two men in dark suits I had never seen before, whispering into their sleeves, watching her with a clinical, predatory focus. My blood turned to ice as I realized they weren't hospital staff. They were there for something else entirely. "You see," Thorne murmured, his eyes fixed on the screen, "my business interests are complex, and some people feel I owe them more than money. By tethering your life to mine, you aren't just saving your mother. You're giving her a shield. But if you walk out that door, I pull the shield back, and whatever is waiting for you in those shadows, well, I wouldn't want to be in your shoes." My hands turned ice cold as I stared at the screen. The men standing by my mother's bed weren't just looming. They were scanning the room, their movements calculated and efficient. They looked less like visitors and more like specialized agents searching for a hidden cache. I turned my gaze back to Victor Thorne, whose expression remained as unreadable as a slab of granite. The air in the room felt suddenly thin, as if the oxygen were being sucked out by the sheer weight of his influence. "Who are they?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. My mind was racing, trying to connect the dots between my mother's humble, agonizing existence and the shadow world Thorne seemed to command. Thorne chuckled, a dry, rattling sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Names are irrelevant. Let's just say that when you possess the kind of capital I do, you attract all sorts of scavengers. Some want the money, some want the secrets, and some are convinced I'm part of some grand organized scheme that they can dismantle from within. Those men? They aren't hospital staff, Elena. They are investigators looking for a specific ledger, a set of files that were allegedly smuggled out of my estate by my previous bookkeeper, a bookkeeper who, coincidentally, was an old acquaintance of your father." My heart skipped a beat. My father had been a quiet man, a man who worked in the archives of a local manufacturing firm before he died of a sudden, mysterious illness. "My father was a simple clerk," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I uttered them. Thorne leaned back, the shadows of the room stretching across his face, accentuating the deep canyons of his features. "Your father was a genius at hiding things in plain sight. He and my former employee were friends, deeply entrenched in a circle that thought they could bypass my protocols. They believed they could siphon off funds and hide them in the accounts of ordinary, provincial people, like your mother. They used her name, her identity, to tuck away the fragments of a massive, illegal operation." The room spun. Everything I thought I knew about my upbringing, the modest life, the struggle, the constant shadow of debt, suddenly felt like a carefully constructed lie. Was my father's death even natural, or had it been the consequence of being tangled in Thorne's web? "So," I said, my voice hardening despite the terror clawing at my throat. "You're not just hiring a nurse. You're hiring a hostage. You think the ledger is hidden in my mother's name, and you need me close to squeeze the information out of her." Thorne picked up a golden pen from his desk, rolling it between his fingers with hypnotic rhythm. "Call it leverage, my dear. If you marry me, you gain my protection. My organization will handle those men in the hospital. We will ensure your mother receives the best care in the world, and we will shield you from the fallout of your father's little adventure. But if you decline, you're just a loose end. And in my world, loose ends have a habit of disappearing before they can even reach the end of the hall." I looked back at the screen. One of the men had reached into his jacket pocket. My breath hitched, waiting to see if he would pull out a weapon or a badge. Instead, he pulled out a small metallic device, waving it over my mother's bedside table, scanning for something hidden in the woodwork. She was still unconscious, completely oblivious to the fact that her deathbed had become a battlefield for a fortune she didn't know existed. "I need time," I said, my hands shaking so violently I had to clench them into fists. "You have exactly 10 minutes, Thorne replied, glancing at a vintage watch on his wrist. "My lawyers have the paperwork prepared. You sign and the men at the hospital receive a signal to stand down and provide medical relief. You walk away and I withdraw my influence. Think carefully, Elena. Your mother is currently breathing on a machine that I personally fund. If I were to tell the hospital board that the account had been closed, they would pull the plug within the hour." I stood up, pacing the small, opulent space. My brain felt like it was fracturing. The smell of his cologne, sandalwood, and expensive tobacco felt suffocating. I caught my reflection in the polished glass of a display cabinet. I looked like a victim. I looked like a pawn. But deep down, I realized that for the first time in my life, I was being given an opening. If I stayed, if I became his wife, I wouldn't just be a caretaker. I would be an infiltrator. I would have access to his home, his records, and perhaps the truth about my father's final days. I walked over to the desk. "I'll do it," I said, my voice steadying. "But I want a guarantee, not just the medical care. I want absolute immunity for my mother. Whatever my father did, she was never involved." Thorne smiled, a thin, predatory curve of the lips. "She's a pawn, Elena. Pawns aren't worth killing if the queen is under my control. We have a deal." He slid the document across the mahogany desk. It was thick, heavy with legal jargon that looked designed to erase my soul. I picked up the pen, my fingers trembling as they touched the cool metal. I wasn't just signing away my youth. I was signing a pact with a man who had built an empire on blood and shadow. As I signed my name, the ink looking like a dark, permanent stain on the white paper, Thorne stood up. He walked to the window, staring out at the rain-slicked city. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Thorne," he said without looking back. "But before you leave, there's something you need to understand about this house. The staff here? They aren't just servants. They are guards, and they have orders to watch your every move. You are never to go into the basement, and you are never to ask about the sound that comes from behind the north wall at 3 a.m. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "What sound?" He turned to face me, his milky eyes suddenly sharp, glinting with a hidden, frantic energy. "The sound of someone trying to get out. My predecessor, the woman who held your position before you. She decided she didn't want to be a wife anymore. She thought she could sneak out through the servants' entrance. She was wrong." My blood ran cold. "Where is she now, Victor?" He didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward a heavy, reinforced door at the back of his study and pulled it open. The sound that hit me was unmistakable. A rhythmic, desperate thumping against wood, followed by a muffled, guttural scream that was cut short as if a hand had been clamped over a mouth. He looked at me, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face, and pulled a key from his pocket, dangling it in front of my eyes. "She's been living under our feet for 3 months, he whispered. "And now that I have a replacement, I have no more use for the old one. Would you like to do the honors?" I recoiled, my back hitting the cold mahogany of the desk. The sound from behind the reinforced door was more than just a noise. It was the acoustic manifestation of a nightmare I had just walked into willingly. My pulse was a frantic bird trapped in my throat. I stared at the key dangling from Thorne's gnarled fingers, the brass reflecting the dim, amber light of the study. He wasn't joking. He was testing me, measuring my capacity for cruelty or perhaps for survival. "I am a nurse by circumstance, not a butcher," I said, my voice barely holding its structural integrity. "If this is your way of initiating me into your household, you've misjudged me." Thorne's expression didn't flicker. He didn't blink. His milky eyes locked onto mine with a terrifying, unblinking intensity. He let out a long, wheezing breath that sounded like a dying engine. "The world is not built on morality, Elena. It is built on consequences. That woman in there? She was greedy. She thought she could steal the very accounts she was hired to manage. She tried to dismantle my life from the inside just like your father attempted before he met his end. She deserves exactly what she's getting." He dropped the key onto the blotter between us. It made a sharp final clack that echoed in the vaulted room. "You want your mother safe? You want the debt erased? Then prove your loyalty. Lock the door properly, turn the deadbolt twice, and ensure the soundproofing seals are engaged. The guards report to me, but they will be watching to see if you have the stomach for the role you've chosen. If you hesitate, if you show weakness, they will report it. And we both know what happens to those who are deemed unreliable in my estate." I looked at the key, then at the door. I was paralyzed. My mind flashed back to the hospital, to the thin, frail frame of my mother and the vultures currently circling her bedside. If I didn't play along, if I didn't perform this grotesque ritual, I would lose everything. I reached out, my fingers trembling uncontrollably, and picked up the key. The metal was unnaturally cold. I walked toward the reinforced door. Every step felt like walking toward my own grave. As I approached, the thumping stopped. A breathy, wet sound emanated from the gap at the bottom, the sound of someone weeping, muffled and broken. "Help me," the voice whispered from the other side, so faint it might have been my own conscience playing tricks on me. He isn't. He's not what you think." "Do it, Elena," Thorne commanded from behind me, his voice a low, vibrating growl. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I slid the key into the heavy industrial lock. The mechanism groaned as I turned it, the sound of metal sliding against metal sounding like a death knell. I pushed the heavy bolt into place, locking the door from the outside. With a trembling hand, I engaged the additional latches, sealing the woman inside. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and infinitely more terrifying than the noise had been. "Excellent," Thorne murmured, appearing at my shoulder. I flinched, but he didn't touch me. He stood just close enough that I could smell the rot of his age, a scent of old books and something more metallic, like dried blood. "You are learning quickly. Now we have a wedding to prepare for, and a funeral. Not your mother's, of course. The official passing of my previous wife. We'll need someone with your specific grief to play the part." He walked toward the door, signaling for me to follow. As I crossed the threshold of the study, I looked back one last time at the reinforced door. A small, dark smear of what looked like grease, or perhaps something much darker, had stained the floor near the frame. My heart was breaking, not just for the woman in the room, but for the girl I had been an hour ago. That girl was gone, buried under the weight of a transaction that now seemed to have no exit. He led me through a hallway lined with portraits of ancestors I didn't recognize, men with eyes like thorns, cold and calculating. We arrived at a side parlor where a woman in a stark, black uniform stood waiting with a stack of papers and a set of clothes. "This is Mrs. Gable, my head of security," Thorne introduced her, not looking back. "She will handle your transformation. Tonight we move you to the main estate. Tomorrow the world will be introduced to the new Mrs. Thorne." Mrs. Gable stepped forward, her eyes scanning me with the detachment of a surgeon evaluating a cadaver. "Take off the coat," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. I complied, my hands shaking. As I peeled off my worn thrift store jacket, I noticed something tucked into the lining of my sleeve. It was a small, folded piece of paper I hadn't noticed before. A note that must have been slipped into my pocket while I was in the waiting room, during those frantic minutes before I left for the office. I moved my hand subtly, shielding it from Mrs. Gable's view, my heart thumping against my ribs. "What are you hiding?" Mrs. Gable snapped, stepping forward, her hand reaching toward my arm. "Nothing," I said, backing away, my mind scrambling for a distraction. I just have a rash, the stress, the hospital. I don't want to show it." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "A rash? Let me see." She lunged forward, grabbing my wrist with a grip like a vice. I tried to pull away, but she was stronger than she looked. She twisted my arm, forcing me to drop the note. It fluttered to the floor like a wounded bird. Before I could scramble for it, her boot came down, pinning the paper to the hardwood. She stooped down, picked it up, and leveled a look at me that promised agonizing consequences. "I thought we discussed the rules of this house," she hissed, her face inches from mine. She unfolded the note. Her eyes swept over the scribbled lines, my father's handwriting unmistakably, and her expression shifted from irritation to genuine shock. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her voice dropping to a whisper. I looked at the note, my breath catching in my throat as I recognized the familiar, jagged script. It wasn't just a message, it was a set of coordinates, and underneath them, a single terrifying question. The vault isn't the basement. It's the heart of the machine. If you're reading this, don't marry him. Find the frequency. I don't know, I lied, my voice cracking. Mrs. Gable stared at me, then looked toward the study door where Thorne had disappeared. A flicker of something, not fear, but a strange, dark ambition, crossed her face. She crumpled the note in her fist and shoved it into her own pocket. "If he sees this, he won't just kill you," she whispered. Leaning in so close, her breath tickled my ear. "He'll erase the memory that you ever existed. But if you're brave enough to follow what's on that paper, you might find the one thing that can actually bring him down." She turned to leave, but stopped, glancing back over her shoulder. "But you need to be careful, Elena. The person who left this note for you, they're already inside the house, and they're watching us right now." The air in the parlor grew heavy, the silence punctuated only by the distant rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock, a sound that, in this house, felt like a countdown to an inevitable disaster. Mrs. Gable didn't wait for my reaction. She turned on her heel, her dark, polished shoes clicking sharply against the floorboards as she retreated down the dim hallway. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The note was gone, or rather, it was in the hands of the very woman who was supposed to be my jailer. The vault isn't the basement, it's the heart of the machine. The words played over and over in my mind, a rhythmic, maddening refrain. What machine? This estate was an architectural behemoth, a sprawl of Victorian Gothic stone and modern, cold-pressed steel. I looked around the parlor. The walls were adorned with ornate, gilded mirrors that seemed to reflect more than just the room. They seemed to catch the shadows of people who weren't there. I thought of the woman locked behind the reinforced door, the way she had looked at me through the gap, her eyes filled not just with fear, but with a desperate, frantic warning. I moved toward the doorway, my limbs feeling heavy, as if I were wading through deep water. I had to know. I had to find the source of that frequency, whatever that meant. I remembered my father, the way he would spend hours in his tiny basement study back home, tinkering with old radios and circuit boards. He'd always claimed he could hear the background hum of the world. Back then, I thought he was losing his grip on reality. Now, standing in the heart of Thorne's empire, I realized he hadn't been talking about physics. He had been talking about surveillance. I crept toward the main hallway, keeping my back to the wall, listening for the soft tread of the security detail. The estate was vast, a labyrinth of rooms that were kept purposefully dark. As I passed the heavy oak door to the library, I saw a flicker of movement, a shadow detaching itself from the bookshelf. I froze, my breath hitching, but it was just a portrait of Thorne, swaying slightly in a draft. Then I heard it. A low, humming vibration, barely audible, vibrating through the floorboards and up into the soles of my shoes. It was a frequency, a steady, pulsating thrum, thrum, thrum that seemed to emanate from the very walls. I followed the vibration, my hands tracing the ornate molding of the wainscoting. I reached a dead end, a wall covered in a massive floor-to-ceiling mirror. I pressed my ear against the cool glass. The sound was deafening here, a mechanical heartbeat that filled my skull. I reached out, my fingers brushing the edges of the mirror. It wasn't fixed. There was a tiny seam in the wood paneling, almost invisible to the naked eye. I pressed down on a concealed catch, and with a soft mechanical hiss, the mirror pivoted outward, revealing a narrow, hidden corridor bathed in a faint, eerie blue light. I didn't think. I just moved. I stepped into the darkness, the mirror closing silently behind me. The corridor was a stark departure from the luxury of the house, lined with tangled wires, flickering LED screens, and humming server towers that seemed to stretch into the abyss. It looked like a command center, a nerve cluster for everything Thorne controlled. And there, sitting at a desk cluttered with monitors, was someone I never expected to see. It was my mother's doctor from the hospital. He didn't look like a physician anymore. His white coat was discarded, replaced by a dark tactical vest. He was hunched over a keyboard, his fingers moving with a speed that blurred. He stopped when he heard me, spinning his chair around with a look of pure, unadulterated shock. "Elena," he hissed, his face draining of color. "What in God's name are you doing here?" "You," I whispered, my mind reeling. You told me she was dying. You told me the only way to save her was to come here. You were part of this?" He stood up, his posture shifting, his eyes scanning the corridor behind me. "I had to get you into the inner circle, Elena. It was the only way to bypass the external security. If I hadn't pushed you into Thorne's hands, you would have been an outsider looking at a fortress you couldn't penetrate. We've been trying to get inside for years. We." I grabbed his arm, my nails digging into his skin. "Who is we? And what is this place?" "This is the monitoring hub," he said, gesturing to the screens. Every monitor showed a different view of the house. The kitchen, the halls, the bedrooms, and even the room where the woman was locked away. Thorne isn't just an old man with money. He's the center of an organized scheme that tracks every major movement in the city. He's been using your father's research on signal interference to build a net around the entire population, and he's finally perfected it. He pointed to a large central screen that was displaying a countdown, 1:42. "What is that?" I asked, a cold dread washing over me. "That's the activation time," he replied, his voice grim. "In less than 2 hours, he's going to initiate a signal override. It's not just for this house, Elena. It's for every connected device in the city. He's going to seize control of everything, from communication lines to the local power grid. And he's going to use your identity to do it. You're the legal heir, the one who will sign the final authorization once he passes. He's going to frame you for the entire catastrophe." I backed away, the weight of the realization crashing down on me. I wasn't just a hostage. I was a scapegoat designed to bear the weight of an apocalypse. "We have to stop him," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't," the doctor replied, turning back to the monitors. "He's already locked the security protocols. Unless we find the override code, the one your father hid in that note, we're stuck." I froze. "Mrs. Gable has the note. She took it from me in the parlor." The doctor's face paled. "If she takes that to Thorne, he'll know we're here." Just then, a heavy thud echoed from the corridor outside, followed by the sound of a locking mechanism engaging. The blue light in the server room flickered and died, leaving us in total darkness. A voice, cold and amused, cut through the silence from a speaker somewhere above our heads. "I'm so glad you decided to explore the house, my dear," Thorne's voice rasped, amplified and distorted. "But you've always been so curious. It's such a shame, because the security system just engaged the lockdown, and this room is about to be purged of all oxygen." I gasped, my lungs already feeling the pinch. I scrambled toward the exit, but the heavy steel door had already sealed shut. The doctor grabbed my hand, dragging me toward a small maintenance hatch in the corner. "There's a backup path," he hissed, "but it leads directly into the basement and it's trapped." As we pried the hatch open, a light flooded the room from the ceiling. Standing there, silhouetted against the bright, artificial glow, were two figures holding high-tech weaponry. They weren't just guards, they were professionals. And behind them, holding my crumpled note, stood Mrs. Gable, a small, cruel smile playing on her lips. She looked at me, then at the doctor, and raised her hand, signaling the men to fire. The muzzle flashes illuminated the room like strobe lights in a funeral parlor, turning the air into a chaotic storm of hot lead and splintered steel. I didn't think. I lunged, shoving the doctor into the narrow, dark crawl space of the maintenance hatch just as the guards unleashed a volley of fire. The sound was deafening, a high-pitched ringing that swallowed my senses. I scrambled into the shadows after him, the heavy metal door slamming shut behind us with a resonant final thud that cut off the screams of the dying machinery. "Keep moving!" the doctor yelled, his voice strained and panicked. We were in a ventilation shaft that smelled of ozone and ancient dust. He tapped a glass panel on his wrist-mounted terminal, and a small, flickering map projected into the dark. "If we follow this line, we come out behind the master server. That's where he's holding the authorization keys." "He's going to kill us, isn't he?" I gasped, my lungs burning as we crawled through the claustrophobic space. "He's going to try," the doctor replied, his eyes fixated on the terminal. "But he forgot one thing. Your father didn't just hide the code. He integrated it into the house's heartbeat. He knew Thorne would eventually try to override the city's entire network. He built a kill switch, and the only way to activate it is through the biometric signature of a direct descendant." The crawlspace ended abruptly above a platform that overlooked the main server room. Below us, Thorne stood in a pool of clinical light, his back to us, staring at a wall of monitors that pulsed with the ominous rhythmic count. 0 hours, 15 minutes, 0 seconds. He was gloating, his voice booming over the intercom as he addressed some unseen audience, likely his associates awaiting the final confirmation. Mrs. Gable stood at the console, her face a mask of cold, professional efficiency, her hand hovering over the execute key. "Now," I whispered. We didn't wait for a tactical entry. We dropped from the vent, hitting the metal flooring with a clang that rang out like a gunshot. Thorne spun around, his face twisting in a mask of impotent rage. Mrs. Gable reached for her sidearm, but the doctor lunged, tackling her before she could draw. I didn't look at them. I scrambled toward the console, my eyes locked on the blinking red authorization field. "Don't touch it!" Thorne shrieked, his voice cracking. He lunged for me, his gnarled hands clawing at the air. "That network belongs to me. Everything in this city, the banks, the power, the lives of everyone in the province. It's all mine to control. If you break that seal, you destroy the infrastructure." "I'm not destroying it," I hissed, my hand trembling as I reached for the glass-covered interface. "I'm setting it free." Thorne was feet away, his face purple with exertion. I didn't hesitate. I slammed my hand onto the biometric scanner. A searing, white-hot light exploded from the console, blinding everyone in the room. A high-pitched whine filled the chamber, growing in intensity until it felt like the walls were vibrating. I saw the screen change, the red countdown vanishing, replaced by a cascade of green flowing data that began to purge every file, every illicit link, every shadow-tethered account Thorne had spent decades building. Thorne collapsed, his hands clutching his chest, his eyes wide with horror as he watched his empire evaporate into digital static. The sound of the purging system was like a dam breaking, a roar of information being deleted, files being wiped clean, and the city's power grid resetting to its original decentralized state. "You've killed it all," Thorne wheezed, his voice fading. "You've left us with nothing." "No," I said, standing over him, my breath coming in ragged gasps. "I've left you with the truth." The room plunged into darkness, then emergency lights flickered to life. Mrs. Gable was unconscious, the doctor standing over her, panting, his tactical vest scorched. In the distance, we could hear the wail of sirens. Not Thorne's security, but the real authorities. The signal had been sent. The override had been detected. The internal security system of the estate had signaled the local police the moment the authorization was blocked. In the weeks that followed, the world changed. The organized scheme Thorne had spent decades building was dismantled piece by piece. His financial records, exposed by the kill switch, became the smoking gun for a dozen federal investigations. My mother, finally free of the debt and the shadow of the man who had been slowly killing her, recovered in a private clinic that was actually dedicated to healing, not to manipulation. I never went back to the estate. I never saw Thorne again, though I heard the news of his passing in a high-security hospital ward, his legacy reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale in a textbook. As for the woman who had been trapped behind the north wall, she was found alive and broken, but she had a family to return to. She thanked me once, with a letter that I never opened, preferring to leave that chapter of my life completely closed. I returned to my provincial home, not as the girl who was crushed by poverty and fear, but as the woman who had stared into the heart of a machine and forced it to stop. The house was still there, the debts were gone, and for the first time in my life, the silence of the night wasn't heavy or threatening. It was just quiet. And in that quiet, I finally found the one thing that no billionaire could ever buy or sell, a future that was entirely and defiantly my own. I looked out at the streetlights, humming peacefully in the dark, and knew that the frequency I heard now was just the world finally, breathing on its own terms.